Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. And today, I want to talk about what would happen if Donald Trump were to be convicted of a serious crime in 2024, and how would that affect the electoral map. Before we get started with the video, please hit that like button, subscribe if you're new. And so, guys, this is basically an unprecedented time in American political history where we have a candidate that's running that is basically on trial during the election campaign. Now, I personally believe that these are political indictments that are being timed specifically to infringe on his campaigning abilities during the election cycle, which has actually every single time that Trump's legal troubles have always been in the news, or if anything's even really come up, Trump's always gained the advantage in the primary, but also in the general election polling as well. Biden's lead always gets cut down to almost nothing, or Trump even ends up taking the lead whenever some political, woes for Donald Trump regarding, criminality and, legal indictments. When those come up in the news, Trump always seems to surge quite a bit. However, I think if Trump is convicted, I think that yes, it'll basically ignite the MAGA base like you've never seen before. White working class voters, almost all of them would basically kind of back Trump. But what would really happen is the political climate would get ridiculously polarized to the point where the map would probably look a little cursed. Now, can Trump still win in this scenario? Yes, but I think it's going to look very, very interesting. And I think people are going to be very surprised by my prediction for this. And if you notice, I do have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here, not because he's going to win any electoral votes in this scenario, but because I do actually think it's important to have him here to kind of justify some of the margins I would characterize in some of these states. Now, I do have the 2020 results pulled up and I have my model. However, the model shows, I feel like if Trump were to actually be convicted, so many dynamics would change that I don't think that this model would end up being able to account for that. And so at that point, I would kind of have to go off my political instincts and really kind of make a educated guess as to where all the states would end up going. And Ready Go Politics posted this Quinnipiac survey where they asked people, do you think that the Mahan district attorney's case involving former President Trump is mainly involved by politics or mainly motivated by the law? And basically, 62% of nationwide voters believe that it is mainly motivated by politics in this hypothetical scenario. And mainly law is 32% of the electorate. 29% of Democrats believe that this is mainly politics. 70% also believe of independents believe that this is mainly politics. And even a majority of women and men believe the same thing. And white college grads are actually tied in this category. And funny enough, the age group that believes this by the biggest amount is actually the youngest voting bloc, which is pretty interesting. And so this is not a good look for the Democrats either, but I also feel like turnout amongst very low propensity Democratic voters, like you saw in 2020, which is how Biden was able to somehow get 81 million votes. I feel like a lot of that would come back. And so Donald Trump would be in a unique scenario because right now I feel like Trump would win the election pretty easily. But if he does get convicted, I feel like at the end of the day, what's going to happen is yes, Trump will gain a lot of voters, but I think Biden would retain a lot of voters as well. And it would be pretty hard for Trump to win the popular vote at that point. And so we're going to fill out the map based on that. And so actually, I'm going to leave Utah blank for a second, and you're going to see why. My margin for the safe states is plus 10 and up. So I know you guys are going to be like, whoa, what's going on there? But I'm going to get to that in a second. And you guys will see that pretty much all these states would end up being safe Republican, over 10-point victories. Even South Carolina, I'd expect it to be over a 10-point win for Donald Trump. And then you'd have the safe Democratic states, Hawaii, California, Oregon, Washington. These margins would end up getting even more Democratic from 2020. They would completely swing to the left because major city areas would he basically Biden would max out in like the major city areas pretty much because of this. However, the rural areas would probably still trend a couple points to the right. So you just see a very, very big political divide in the country to the point where the blue states just get bluer. Some of the blue states You basically the blue states get bluer, red states get redder, and then the ones in the middle just kind of go all over the place. That's basically what would happen. Colorado, I think would end up being close to like an 18-point win for Biden. I think that it would trend the state super far to the left. Kind of how like Donald Trump kind of trended Florida to the right by a lot. I think Colorado would basically do the same thing. I think Iowa and Ohio, I think would end up being like 13-point wins for Trump. I think he'd win these very easily in this scenario. I think he'd even win Florida fairly easily in this scenario. I think he'd win Florida by like 11 in this scenario. He did really good. I think in this scenario, Trump, I think, would actually win Hispanics nationwide in this scenario, but Biden would actually be doing really good with 65 plus voters. I think Biden would actually only be losing them by like 2 to 3 points in this scenario, but Trump would be doing far better with young voters. Like he'd only be losing them by 10. He'd only be losing millennials by like probably 15 points. So you'd see these very big major demographic swings, but also third party turnout, I think would be sort of high in a way because what would happen is Biden would retain some support back, but I think Robert F. Kennedy would just turn out a bunch of voters that have never voted before, and I think he'd have a pretty big movement this cycle. I think Trump probably in this scenario would get like possibly 38% of the popular vote. Biden would get like 40% of the popular vote, and RFK would probably be getting about like 15, 18%. Like I think he'd probably be getting like Ross Perot level of support in this hypothetical matchup. And I wouldn't expect Biden to get any more popular either. So don't take this as a, oh, Biden's gonna, surge in, millions of votes. Not necessarily. I think Biden probably ends up getting like 78 million in this scenario. Trump probably gets like 75, 76. And RFK probably gets around like 20 to 30 million votes or something like that. That's probably what end up happening in this hypothetical. I think Texas would be like a 9-point win for Trump, similar to his 2016 victory. Even the political indictment, I still don't think would affect his, process of winning the state of Texas. I think that the southern border would trend massively to the right in this scenario. I think you'd see a lot of these border counties flip red, but I think the suburban areas would continue to trend left. So for that reason, the state would be under 10 points, but I think that the southern counties would trend to the right by so much that they'd actually outvote the suburban shifts in the major city areas in the state. I think New Mexico would be like a 12, 13-point win for Biden. I think Biden would probably do pretty well here in this hypothetical matchup just because the white vote in the state is really what drives the entire state to vote the way it does as a whole. And so if a lot of white suburban, college educated voters amongst the Democratic base are swinging to the left because Trump got convicted or whatever, I think that that would probably sway the state all the way to the left even more than 2020. I'd say the same thing for Virginia. I think Virginia would end up becoming like a 12 or a 13-point win for Biden. I think it vote to the probably vote around the same as New Mexico, kind of like last time. I think Biden would win it by 13. Rural counties would get a lot redder, but the Nova area, like a lot of these places, would end up getting very Democratic. Now, what's interesting in this scenario is you're going to see Illinois and New York vote under 10 points. Again, guys, it's going to be a really cursed map. RFK is getting like 18% of the vote on the national level. And so that it's going to be a weird map. And the fact that Trump is being, convicted of a criminal trial, I think would definitely affect the way the map looks. Illinois and New York have a decent black population. I think in this scenario, Trump would make the most amount of gains with African American voters. He wouldn't win them, but I think he'd made a decent amount of gains with them to actually get the states under 10 points. And I think that, a lot of the illegal immigrants coming into the city areas, really kind of diving into these places and stealing people's jobs essentially and making the unemployment seem lower than what it actually is really affecting citizens living here every single day, especially in these major areas and especially in these two states. And so I think that with the political indictment, I think that a lot of African American voters would be very dissatisfied with that and trying to see, okay, well, they're trying to stop Trump, but he might be the one to be able to fix this. And clearly Biden is not doing anything about it, and he's making it worse, and so I think those voters would get really pissed off, and I think they would trend heavily to the right, and so that's why Illinois and New York, I'd see them voting to the right of Colorado, New Mexico, and even Virginia in this case. And the Hispanic vote in New Mexico would also trend to the right, but I don't think that the it would outvote the white vote margin by that much to the point where it'd do better for Trump than 2020 in this scenario. And so now we kind of come down to the closer swing states, and you've noticed Alaska is not filled in. I'm gonna get to that in a second. Means first in the scenario would probably be safe. Trump would probably win, basically win this district. Means second by probably a likely margin, just because I think RFK would get a lot of votes here, so the margin's gonna look a little wonky here. I think Biden wins Maine at large by like a lean margin, but it's mainly because RFK is taking a lot of votes from Biden here. So even though, Colorado's like an 18-point win, that means Maine at large, realistically, if Colorado's like 18 points, this should be like a 13-point win. But because RFK and, third party candidates in general do really good here, and I think he'd be pretty popular up here. So I think he'd take a lot of votes from Biden. And so the state, I think, would actually be pretty close despite all the circumstances. I think New Hampshire would actually vote right in line with New York. I think New York would be like an 8-point win for Biden. And I think New Hampshire would be the same thing as well. I think Trump would really struggle here in the state, especially since even though his primary performance wasn't even that great, I think with the conviction, I think a lot of white liberals here are going to just completely fall off the cliff. And I think it's going to ruin his chances in the state completely. And so looking at this, Utah, I think, would be under 10 points for Trump. And it's mainly because RFK, I think, would have a huge surge here, not necessarily because Biden would do well here. I actually think Biden would get third place here. And I even think in a lot of the, kind of the, rural states, I think RFK would get second place in Wyoming. He'd get second place in a state like, West Virginia. I even think in a state like Arkansas, he may be able to even get second place, and maybe not Kentucky, but maybe like Idaho, even North Dakota. Like, I think RFK would be able to get second place in a lot of the rural states as well in the scenario. Alaska, I think, would fall under 5. I think Trump would win it by 3 points, and I think, again, it'd be because RFK would just really get a huge surge in the state, and RFK's voters in this scenario would not necessarily be, defected voters from either candidate, because after the political indictment, both major party candidates would retain a lot of their base. After that, I think it's just RFK would turn out a lot of first time voters. And I think that's why he'd be able to make the margin in Alaska way closer than a lot of people would expect. And what's going to be crazy is that I actually think North Carolina and Georgia would vote to the right of Alaska in this scenario. I actually think Georgia would vote for Trump by like 6 points, and North Carolina would vote for Trump by 7 points. And the reason why I say that is because of the fact that these states kind of have decent sized black populations, and these political indictments are not very popular amongst black voters. I mean, after the mugshot, the black trends in the polling really accelerated for Trump when the mugshot came out. And so, if you really think about it, if he does get convicted, I really don't suspect Biden to do good in Georgia at all. I think he'd probably see really depressed turnout. I think RFK would take a lot of votes from Biden here. I think Trump would kind of get a lot of his base back, and he'd probably end up getting like 30% of the black vote in the state, more than likely. And I think a similar situation would happen in North Carolina too. However, I think the white vote would also help carry Trump to the finish line in the state as well. Now, Arizona, I think, would end up being a likely margin for Biden. I think he'd end up winning it by about 6 points in the scenario. I think Maricopa would just completely trend off, left off a clip. I think that he'd probably end up winning it by like probably 8 or 9 points. Like, Biden would do ridiculously good in Arizona. A lot of people that probably would have voted for Trump are probably just going to vote for RFK, and RFK would kind of eat into Trump's support as well, get a lot of new voters in the state. Biden would still do worse in turnout, but I think Trump would just do really awful in Arizona. Like, he'd do terrible here. in my opinion. Nebraska second, I think would still vote for Biden, but I think that it'd be a lot closer just because they redistricted the state. They just redistricted this area, and so I think that's why it would more than likely end up being a lean margin, but it'd probably be like a 4-point winner for Biden. And then you have Minnesota, which I think would be around an 8-point win for Biden. I think he would improve in the state, in this scenario. I think he'd retain a lot of the, Palestine, Israel voters, because I think at this point, if Trump gets a political indictment, I think a lot of these, Israel Palestine protesters, I think would kind of come home to Biden. Most of them would, a subsection of them probably vote for RFK, but I think a lot of them would kind of come home to Biden. I think he would do fairly well in Minnesota in the scenario. And that kind of literally leaves us with just Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And I said that white working class voters are going to trend very right this cycle, and that puts Wisconsin in the lean margin for Trump. I think Trump would probably end up winning Wisconsin by 3 points in this scenario. I think it probably trends far to the right in this scenario. Biden's probably winning the popular vote by like 2 points here. And you might say, well, why is Arizona likely and New York is likely, but Colorado's 18 points and California is a bigger margin for Biden, but New Jersey's a bigger margin, but then, Trump is doing bad in Alaska and Utah, but then Trump's winning Wisconsin. But how is it only Biden plus two? It's because Trump would be running up the score in a lot of the rural areas in Ohio and Iowa to the point where it's like he's kind of making up for that popular vote, you know, disconnect from the bigger states. And Florida would probably end up being like a 13, 14-point win in this scenario. And he'd make up the margins in like Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina as well. And so that's why, the popular vote would only be like Biden plus two. But again, this is just my political instinct on this scenario, and that's why I don't think my model would really be viable anymore in this scenario either. And so the last three states we're coming down to are Michigan and Pennsylvania. Now, I do think Trump actually narrowly takes Michigan in this scenario. I think he barely ends up taking it just because of the EV mandate in the state. And I think that a lot of, union workers would be really dissatisfied by Biden, and how the media is really focusing on Trump's political indictment rather than, real issues. And so I think that Michigan would end up going to Trump in this hypothetical scenario by the closest of closest margins. Now, the last two states, Nevada and Pennsylvania. Nevada is really tough, but I'd say it probably goes lean Republican just because of the fact that Hispanics would trend to the right quite significantly nationwide. And I think that would provide Trump the victory that he would need in the state of Nevada as a whole. I think he'd have a major shift in Clark County. However, I think that Washoe would probably end up trending to the left in this case. But I think in Clark County, he'd have a major shift that he would need in order to win the state by about 2 to 3 points, similar to Wisconsin. Now, Pennsylvania is the interesting state here. I actually think that in this scenario, I think Biden probably ends up eking out a victory in Pennsylvania by about like 2 points. I think Biden would probably end up winning the state by 2 points because I think just all the suburban areas would just completely trend left off a cliff. Like the city areas would actually become more Republican by a lot. Like I think Philadelphia city proper would probably end up trending to the right by like 15, 20 points. Like it'd get a lot redder, but I think the suburban areas would end up trending so left off a cliff that Biden would probably just end up doing better in the state. And so literally the entire election literally just hinges on Michigan. If Biden were to end up winning Michigan, Joe Biden would end up becoming the president of the United States, but I think Trump would end up still picking it off at the end of the day in this scenario, just because I think that even with the, also not just to mention the union workers, but I think that Biden has fallen out so much with the Israel Palestine crowd that I still think, even in this scenario, it would still affect him. And so, this is the final electoral college result if Trump gets convicted of a serious crime in 2024. I know that this is a super big hot take that people are going to really disagree with, but this is my personal, educated guess in every single state. based off my political instincts as of right now. So if you guys did enjoy the video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, make sure to follow Twitter and join the Discord in the description down below. And if you guys disagree or agree, please leave a comment down below so we can have a discussion about this. And I hope to see you guys very, very soon.